afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. I must first of all say how grateful I am to Dr. Dalal Azim for inviting me to be present here today to say a few words on the question of Islam and child rights. Now, I have to say at the very outset that child rights is or had become my passion and a hobby. And Islam and child rights is something that I have started looking into the last few weeks, and I'm learning still. Now, let me start with stating the very obvious. Children are human beings, and they are entitled to all the rights of any person in this universe or in this world. All the human rights apply to them. Recently, the new Commission coordinator for the rights of the child at the European Commission, Marie-Cécile Guillaume, said, children's rights are human rights under any circumstances. Now, she was, of course, referring and relating to the injustices, the atrocities faced by children in the Ukraine. On the other hand, take it a little bit further, we can say that children are citizens of any given country, unless of course they are born in Burma or Myanmar and they are Rohingya, because they don't have citizenship. There are some other places where citizenship is not allowed, but that aside, children are citizens. And as citizens of any country, they are, of course, entitled to the benefits of all the laws of the constitution of that country and all the other laws of that country. So, if children are entitled to the protection of all the laws of the country, why does one need further laws to protect children? Let me give you one example. The penal laws in possibly every country prohibit person from hitting each other. But does that stop the teachers, the parents, other legal guardians from hitting their children, their wards? Sadly, corporal punishment is ever present across the globe. If any of you have been to a public school in this country, you will know that still corporal punishment is still there, particularly in independent schools. I attended one many moons ago, and on one evening we were caught by the headmaster in doing something obviously wrong, and we were all given the slipper. And I believe the headmaster knew exactly who the culprit was, because I remember that I only got a small tap. So he knew who the real person was behind the misdemeanor. But as I say, it still exists, particularly in the independent, non-registered schools in this country. And as late as the 21st of March 2022, Wales banned punishment on children. In the year 2020, Scotland banned corporal punishment. And there, Dr. Cyril Daly had been campaigning against corporal punishment since 1967. More than 30 states of the United States of America have now banned corporal punishment. That means there are more than 20 states, or about 20 states, still allow corporal punishment in their schools. So, what it boils down to is that children can be beaten. And that is against the law if the person beaten was an adult, but allowed, sadly, if the person is a child. In some schools, I'm told, the parents sign a contract saying that the school will be allowed to punish the children or dish out corporal punishment, which again I think is totally wrong, because it is not the parent who is getting beaten, it is the child, and the child has not entered the contract. So, if there is time and if anybody wants to know, I can tell you how we managed to get rid of corporal punishment in the schools in Bangladesh. But that's quite a story, as I say, I can tell you later on. We're talking about schools. What about in the home? Does the parent have the authority to beat his child? Let's go to a different topic. Injuring someone with a cutting weapon is illegal. If I just cut someone using a knife, I can be sent to jail. I'm sure you're all aware of the phenomenon of female genital mutilation. It still happens. Although banned in many countries, even in those countries it still happens. Egypt, for example, in 2008, they said that 75% of girls between the age of 15 and 17 had been mutilated. Now, because it happened in Europe, and because it happens in Sudan, because it happens in some other Muslim countries, it was understood to be a Muslim phenomenon, which is totally incorrect, because it also happens in some parts of India, and I dare say also some parts of Indonesia and other parts of the Horn of Africa, where even the Christians allow such practices. But bottom line is, it's illegal to cut someone, but here it is legal. Although banned in many countries, it still happens. So, despite laws being there against certain offences which would otherwise be offences, these atrocities still take place, and with impunity. Look at the clergy. Things are now coming out which one never thought would come out. Even the Pope is possibly a little bit disgusted with what the clergy have done in the past. So, why these things happen with children? The answer is quite simple. Children are small. They are by definition vulnerable. They are powerless. And although at some point in time we were also small, we tend to forget. And when we grow up, we tend to want to exert our powers. And who better to exert power against someone who cannot retaliate because of their size, because of their lack of strength, because of their lack of physical and mental maturity. So, children's rights hardly existed. In the 16th century, I'm not a historian, many of you are, children had no rights. Certainly in practical terms. Parents, even in the Roman times, they could actually sell off their children. They could sacrifice their children. Even now I understand there are some countries where children are sacrificed, literally. Now, again, My personal view is that it only happens because the children can't protest, because they cannot fight back. So in the 16th century, 17th century, even 18th, 19th century, children were treated as chattels. Particularly in the mines, they worked from the age of 5, 6, 7, and I keep in my mind a picture of a child pulling a cart in the coal mine. Every time I even think of it, I get claustrophobic. They were small and useful to pull small carts of mined material because they could pass through the shafts, small, narrow shafts. So the realization came that children have the rights, and who other than a rabbi, Jewish faith, of the Free Synagogue in New York, who stood against child labor. That was in the early 20th century. He once wrote, and I may quote, referring to the poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, which was published in 1843, called The Cry of the Children. And he said, "The cry of the children," telling the tale of children working in the mines, he said, "Seeing that the cry of the children has not been heard, it is meet that we here cry out on behalf of children in protest against the inequity of the enslavement of the child, which, if anything, is even more unjust and iniquitous than the enslavement of men." So this was the sort of beginning, if you like, of the feeling that children should not be made to work. You all know about Charles Dickens's works, writing when in the early 19th century, where he portrayed the picture of the children in the streets of London, the poor children who are made to steal, who are made to beg, who are maimed in order to get more alms. So that was there. You all may be also aware of what happened to girls and boys to some extent in the UK, in England particularly, northern England, where girls were married off at the age of 2, 3, 4 in order to satisfy the debt owed by the father to the other person. It's all on record. I'm not making it up. We talk about child marriage, prevention of child marriage. There's a lot of commotion going on throughout the world now. That's a different lecture. I in fact presented a lecture at Cornell University on child marriage and the problems that emanate from there. But it happened. It happened here on this land. So the laws were enacted to allow children to study as early as probably 1640, when some states in America made sure that the children of that state would receive education. Otherwise the parents would be punished and the children might even be taken away. And children included their own children as well as the children who are working in their household. Laws came into being preventing the employment of children in work conditions, hazardous conditions. But who paid heed to that? In this country, as early as 1893, perhaps, the courts came to the rescue of children, where the courts found that the parents were squandering the property which would otherwise belong to the children. And if I remember the name, Lord Chancellor Thurlow said in a case that the court has arms long enough to prevent the profligate parents from squandering the monies, the property of children. Certainly later on, laws have been developed to protect the property belonging to women and children. But then, has it been enough? If it had been enough, then we would not be, even today, thinking of enacting laws in order to prevent atrocities, in order to protect children in countries like the UK, part of the UK, Wales, Northern Ireland, Ireland, Scotland. So what is happening? The laws are there now, but the implementation of the law is not there. Over the years, there have been development in the child protection laws. The international community, starting with the end of the First World War, and more so at the end of the Second World War, drafted the Convention, United Nations conventions, protocols, etc., in order to protect children, in order to give rights to human rights, UDHR, the ICCPR, and ultimately the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1979, started in 1979, and it was published in 1989, ratified and made to come on the books. Now, what does that have to do with religion? Well, what I can say very simply is that everything done, remember I said about the rabbi trying to protect children from going to work or being made to work? Some minded lady, I think she was an English lady, who founded the Save the Children after the First World War. Now, again, it is not the religion that has led to people developing protective ideas and ideals, but the religion in the person has certainly played a part. The religious views of that person will have reflected in their views towards the children and other vulnerable groups. And as a matter of fact, when the Polish lecturer drafted or started the drive for the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1979, some religious communities were actively involved. It took 10 years to draft the CRC. The core group who promoted the adoption of the CRC and contributed to the drafting included the International Catholic Child Bureau, other NGOs including Amnesty International, Anti-Slavery International, Defense of Children, the International Commission of Jurists, Radha Vernon, the member of the Save the Children International, the Baha'i Faith, Friends of the Quakers, International Council of Jewish Women, the World Jewish Congress, the World Federation of Methodist Women. So, obviously, because of the religious connection of these people who are the core members of the drafting committee, their religious views will have permeated when drafting the actual instrument. Now, how far that relates to Islam? Well, let me just very quickly talk about some of the things that the Quran says. If I can quickly go one by one. Surah number 2, verse before that, just one hadith. I'm sure you're all aware of it. I only just learnt about it. That the man must choose a pious woman as his wife. So that is the beginning of before the conception of the child, preparation for a pious child. And then the hadith that when the child is conceived, the man must provide sustenance, not just for the wife, but sustenance sufficient to keep her in good health, so that the fetus is not in any way harmed. And certainly the woman is bound not to do anything which will harm the fetus. So the right of the child begins at the time of conception, even before the conception. And then Surah 2, verse 233. The mothers shall give suck to their offspring for 2 whole years. If the father desires to complete the term, but he shall bear the cost of their food and clothing on equitable terms. Now, let me just add here, and again, you are in a better position to tell me. The Quran is law for the Muslims. Quran, Sunnah, the basis of Islamic Mohammedan law. And then you have Imman cares, of course. But here, specifically in the Quran, it is said 2 years to suckle the baby. I must say, I cheated. I pestered my mum until I was 5 years old. If you decide on a foster mother for your offspring, there is no blame on you, provided you pay the mother what he offered on equitable terms. So in other words, the duty is still upon the father to provide for milk, breast milk, for the child, either through the mother, or if there's any difficulty with the mother, then through the milk mother. Surah 4. Surah 4 has many attributes relating to the children. Particularly, it talks about orphans and how they should not, any person should not devour the property of the orphan. Incidentally, the orphans and widows, they also manifest in the other religions, particularly the Jewish as well as the Christian religion. They are protected. But Islam particularly talks about not devouring the property of the orphans and the widows. Again, protection of the child. Surah 6, verse 140. Lost are those who slay their children from folly without knowledge. So, life of the child. You all may recall how pagan Arabs used to bury their daughters alive, used to kill their children because they could not provide food for them. So they fear that they would not be able to provide, they would kill their children. The Quran specifically says, don't do it, because it is He, the Almighty, who provides food enough for the child as well as for the parents. So again, protection of the child. Surah 6, verse 151. Say, come, I will rehearse what Allah has really prohibited you from. Join not anything as equal with Him. So that is simple. We provide sustenance for you and for them. Come not nigh to shameful deeds. The shameful deeds were, of course, the burying of girls alive and killing of the sons as well. whether open or secret. Take not life which Allah hath made sacred. Surah 16, verse 58. Again, very poignant language, where talking about the girl child. When news is brought to one of them of the birth of a female child, his face darkens and he is filled with inward grief. With shame does he hide himself from his people because of the bad news he has had. Shall he retain it on sufferance and contempt, or bury it in the dust? Ah, what an evil choice they decide on. So, the Quran, we're talking about 16, 30, 40, 50. 6, 30, 40, 50. How many decades ago? More than a century ago, 1.5 centuries ago. We talked earlier about laws which are being promulgated now to protect the children. This is all there in the Quran for protection of children, for protection of widows, protection of girls. Because Rasulullah specifically said, do not discriminate between your children who are male and female. Because it is Allah who allows you to have both female and male children. There's one hadith where a man came and he sat the boy, his son, on his lap, and the girl was standing. Rasulullah rebuked him because he was not treating his children equally. He was discriminating in favor of the son as against the daughter. Now, the protection of children, again, there's another hadith, Rasulullah, a boy was put on his lap and he urinated on him, on his clothes. The father of the boy rebuked him. And what did our Prophet ﷺ say to him? Don't do it. Because my clothes can be washed. But the damage that you do by rebuking the child in openness is something that is indelible. So, protection of children goes back to the Quran and Sunnah. Again, a repetition in Surah 17, verse 31. Kill not your children for fear of want. We shall provide sustenance for them as well as for you. Verily, the killing of them is a great sin. Surah 25, verse 54. He, the Almighty, established relationships of lineage and marriage. Again, the idea is of family life. It is all across the Quran as well as Sunnah. The essential of maintaining family, kindred, and lineage. On adoption, the Quran is very explicit. You can call someone your son. In other words, you can adopt and call him or her your child. But that is only something that you are saying. It is a fiction, because actually he is not your son or daughter. Nor has he made your adopted sons your sons. Such is only your manner of speech by your mouth. But Allah tells you the truth. Call them by the names of their fathers. That is juster in the sight of Allah. So here we have a difference of opinion with regard to adoption. The adoption there's no clock here, so I don't know how much time I have left. Um, the adoption in the Western sense strictly requires that the child be totally separated, cut off from the biological parents. He or she adopts the name of the adoptive parents. This is something that the Quran prohibits. The reason behind that is very simple. Because if adoption means adopting the name of the parents, adopting the or inheriting the property of the parents, adoptive parents, then that goes against the Quran, because in the Quran, inheritance goes only to blood relatives. And when you have an outsider coming into the family, adopted, and inherits the property of the parents, then the blood relatives are deprived. And it stands to reason that at some point in time, the blood relatives may actually harm the adopted child, because he will be depriving them of the property. Hence, the Western style adoption is prohibited. But then that is not to say that the child cannot be taken under the protective arms of close relative, even a distant relative, or somebody unrelated. So long as the parents, the real biological parents, the father, is identifiable and the child remembers or is told that his father is so and so. Quran says specifically, let him be known by his father. And some of you may be aware, and we had the problem, we still have the problem in this country, where the adoptive children, they don't get to know the parents, their biological parents' details while they're a child. But once they reach the age of 18, they are free to find out about their biological parents. And they sometimes rebel against the adoptive parents for not telling them who their biological parents are. We have seen instances where the adopted children actually go out specifically looking for their biological parents. And they're very resentful towards the system, and particularly towards the adoptive parents, because they have not told them about their parentage, their biological parents. So does not the Quran make sense? I believe it does. It is for the protection of the child that adoption is not allowed. But at the same time, kafala is allowed. The child can be taken under the wings of anyone giving the support to the child. And as for property, well, the parent who takes the child, secures the child, can give him or her a part of his property, gift the property to the child, so long as he is not totally depriving the blood relatives. So here we have the Quran, Sunnah, talking about the protection of the child. Now, when it came to drafting of the CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, as I have said already, some religious groups were involved. But surprisingly, many of the things that I have just talked about find themselves in the CRC. Even to the extent that CRC requires that the child be told about his biological parents. The preamble of the CRC, which was adopted in 1989, talks about the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. It talks about fundamental human rights and the dignity and worth of the human person. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations has proclaimed that the childhood is entitled to special care and assistance. This is what has been given, the special care and assistance throughout the Quran, in various verses, various places. Family as the fundamental group of society and the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all members, particularly children. So again, the importance of the family here coming out in the CRC. And we saw the importance of family and kindred mentioned in the Quran itself. The child should grow up in a family environment. The child, by reason of his physical and mental immaturity, needs special safeguards and care, including appropriate legal protection before as well as after birth. What do we talk about in the Quran and the Hadith, Sunnah? Before and after birth. Protection of the child. Article 2 talks about non-discrimination on the grounds of gender, language, religion, color, political, other opinion, etc. Remember what the Sunnah was? The Prophet ﷺ saying, you do not discriminate between your son and daughter. Treat them equally. Specific requirement of the CRC, the best interest of the child shall be a primary consideration. That goes without saying. That is there across all nations, the laws of the nations. States parties recognize that every child has the inherent right to life. Does that ring a bell? What we read in the Quran? Right to life. Do not bury your children alive. Do not kill your children. CRC 1989 telling us exactly the same thing. Do not kill children. The state parties shall ensure, to the maximum extent possible, the survival and development of the child. The child shall have the right from birth to a name. Again, that is specifically mentioned in the Sunnah. The child must be given a good name. The right to know and be cared for by his or her parents. Doesn't that go against adoption? The Western style adoption, where the parents, the biological parents, are totally cut off. CRC is saying, no. The child has the right to know and be cared for by his or her parents. State parties undertake to respect the child, the right of the child to preserve his or her identity, including nationality, name and family relations. Name and family relations. Does it ring a bell? Kindred. We have created for you your kindred by blood and by marriage. Parents, as the case may be legal guardians, have the primary responsibility for upbringing and development of the child. That cuts across all religions. State parties shall take all appropriate legislative, administrative, social, educational measures to protect the child from all forms of physical or mental violence. Again, remember what the Prophet ﷺ said? Don't rebuke the child for soiling my clothes, because my clothes can be washed. His mental state, the distress you cause by rebuking him in open, is indelible. He will remember it for the rest of his life. He will be affected by it. So, prevent the child from injury or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment or exploitation, including sexual abuse, while in the care of parents, legal guardians, or any other person who has care of the child. Do you remember the clergy, what they did, and what the CRC is now saying? Prevent children from being sexually abused. Access to education. CRC is talking about it. But what did Sunnah say about it? Children must be educated, given a good education. That's the best investment the father can make. Give the child education, even if it means traveling to China. So the importance of education. How many more minutes do I have left? 10 minutes. Okay. Enough of lecturing. Let me give you some prime examples of what is happening. We have all the laws in place, starting from Quran and the Sunnah, and the national laws. Now, I call one of our magistrates to my house for a cup of tea. I talk to him about the Children Act, the law in Bangladesh. And he is well aware of the provisions of protecting the child, etc. I thought, good. As I was showing him the door, after the cup of tea, he said, sir, you know, our children are so mischievous. They're so active in their criminal activities. They should be locked up. What is the problem? The problem is one of attitude. People do not realize that even if a child has somehow developed some deviant behavior, is still nevertheless a child. And the law protects that child in spite of the attitude of the judge. You can't lock him up. The law does not allow him to lock them up. But do you see what he is trying to say? Children who are deviant in their behavior are bad, must be locked up. His thinking is illegal. On the other hand, I was in Armenia talking to their judges about child rights. I can't speak Armenian and he couldn't speak English. I'm not very good at sign language either. But he took me to his court. He was trying to tell me that when the case of a child is brought to his court, he takes off his gown, puts it on the chair, he goes over to the child, sits next to him with his arm over his shoulder, and talks to him. There is a difference. Another judge was telling us an example of a 15-year-old boy who smashed the window of a supermarket. You can imagine how big the supermarket window is. And he went inside, straight to the courtroom, took a lot of sausages, and ran. And he was caught. And I asked, did you punish him? He said, no. He was hungry, he only took sausages. And I said, what about the glass? It's very expensive. He said, well, how would he get in if he didn't break the glass? So, there you have the attitude. Now, how did I come into child rights? It's a long story, but I'll tell you very briefly if I can. In 2006, I was presiding in the High Court Division. A case came to our court of a 15-year-old boy who allegedly raped and murdered an 8-year-old girl. The trial court had sentenced him to death. which is allowed by our law. When the matter was brought to us, the evidence showed that there was absolutely no evidence other than one piece of evidence that the boy confessed to have raped and killed this girl. Of course, I don't know whether any lawyers are present. Confession means confession. So in other words, I did it. I did it, therefore I need to be punished. But the girl's father stated in his testimony that when the boy was caught, he was very badly beaten up by the police. So the confession was extracted from him by physical force or by beating him up. And in the eyes of the law, that confession is no confession. So if that no confession is there, there's no evidence, therefore, in legal terminology, it's a case of acquittal. And I could have written that judgment in maybe one, perhaps 2 pages. But then I realized that all the people concerned, from the beginning of the trial to the conviction, were totally ignorant of the existing law of the country. The judge himself designated himself as the juvenile court, as it was under the old law. But then having done that, he kept the child in prison, and the bottom line, he sentenced the child to death, which is absolutely forbidden by the law. Neither can he keep the child in prison during the trial, and certainly he is not able to sentence the child to either death or imprisonment for life. It's not allowed by the law. So I decided that people concerned should realize what the law actually says, and I went into a big judgment. That book will show you 76 pages. But I did go into detail about the international law involved and the reasons behind the protection of the child and so on. And having done that, I got caught up. People wanted me to write a book, so I wrote a book. Then they wanted me to lecture here and there, so I've been lecturing here and there. It has become quite a passion. But what I'm trying to say is that in spite of the law existing, in spite of all my trainings, judges are still not following the law. We recommended in that judgment that the law should be either amended or new law made in order to conform with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, you may be aware that I believe it's Article 4 of the Convention says that the state parties shall endeavour to incorporate provisions of the CRC into their domestic laws. And to this day, perhaps, possibly 25, 30 countries have done it. The latest that I'm aware of was the Maldives. And I'm only aware of it because in 2017, I was asked to go and talk to them about child rights and drafting the law. And I must say, in 2019, they drafted a law which was far beyond my expectation. And I thought, well, you see, when you advise someone to do something against the state, or which may be against the state, you try to tone down, because if you say too much, then they'll say forget it. So I was a little bit toned down, but then when the law came into the Maldives, it was far better than I had wanted for them to draft. So it is being done in many countries, and I'm sorry to say, I asked UNICEF even yesterday to tell me how many countries had actually incorporated the provisions of the CRC into their domestic laws, and they couldn't tell me. I asked somebody in New York, UNICEF New York, and they couldn't tell me either. But as I understand it, many countries have done it, other countries are in the process of doing it. So this CRC, I consider to be the Bible, if you like, for child rights. But then having the Bible is not enough. I remember a film many years ago. There was a film about cowboys and Indians. And of course, many of you have not seen it. It was, I think it was a John Wayne film, where they actually take the Bible to the Indians, Red Indians. And the chief takes the Bible, he sizes it up and down, and then he shakes it, nothing happens. And then he actually licks it. No, it doesn't taste very nice either. And then he throws it to the ground. But what I'm trying to say, the Bible is only as good if you know what it is, if you know what it says, if you understand what it does. Equally, the law of any country is only as good as it can be if it is implemented in the true light of its inception, conception, and final production. We are still endeavoring to make sure that the law in Bangladesh, the 2013 Act, so in 2006 they decided they would have a new law, and that after a gestation period of 7 years, we got the new law. Initially I was involved in the drafting of it, but then what came out at the end of 7 years is nothing like what it started with. But nevertheless, law is there, but it is only as good as it can be if it is implemented properly. What we're trying to say is that, of course, there was no law initially, unless you take the Quran and Sunnah. There was law. In the Western world, there was no law until the 19th century. But then, even after the law has come into force and into being, is it being implemented properly? In this country, as I understand it, children are children only so long as they don't do horrendous acts of misdemeanor. A child who murders is going to be tried as an adult in the Old Bailey. In our country, it won't happen. Even a child who commits murder, if he does, he'll be tried in the children's court, as the law says. So again, we fictionize. Can a child be an adult? Well, if your sort of feeling or attitude suddenly says, this child is bad, he must be tried as an adult. Does it suddenly stop being a child? He does in this country, and in some other countries too. I think I've spoken for long enough, and I will certainly try to answer your questions. Thank you very much.